Well, once again, we've been given another beautiful opportunity that we can gather together, to assemble together to worship God and to sing praises to his name. And I think about the words of this song that we just sang, just to take him at his word, to rest on his promise. And that's all we want to do. We want to take him at his word, and we want to rest on his promise. And his promises, those are prophecies, and he made those statements, and he kept those promises. And that's all that we are insisting that people acknowledge, is that the prophets and Jesus and his apostles, they made these promises. The prophets made the promises. Jesus reiterated them. The apostles reiterated them. And they posited those promises to be fulfilled in the last days, which is the subject that we are investigating, the last days kingdom. And so as we have been looking at Daniel 2, the vision, the dream there of Nebuchadnezzar, and then again in chapter 7 of Daniel, where Daniel has the dream of the four beasts, and the angel interprets that and tells him that those are four kingdoms, and how that in the days of that fourth kingdom, that there would be an everlasting kingdom established, everlasting dominion would be given to the Son of Man, who would come in the clouds of heaven, in flaming fire, with his holy angels for the opening of the book's judgment. And so this is what we've been looking at. And we want to continue this as we continue our study here. And try to get things to cooperate here. Now, we looked at the parallel texts. Again, now Daniel 7, that's the only prophecy, the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven and so forth. And we've looked at these parallel texts in Matthew 16, Mark 8, and Luke 9, and how that they are exactly parallel, and how that Jesus is pulling from this prophecy in Daniel 7, stating that the Son of Man is about to come in the glory of the Father with the angels, and then he will give reward. Now, I wanted to look at one more point before we move on, and that is in this same text of Matthew 16. And again, you can see the context. Jesus comes to Caesarea Philippi. He asks them, "Who do men say I am?" And so Peter gives the answer there, "You're the Christ, Son of the living God." And so, Jesus says, "On this rock I'll build my church. And the gates of hell, the gates of Hades, shall not prevail against it." But now, what I want us to notice is something else that he states here in this text. And that is, from this time forth, Jesus to show in his disciples how that he must go into Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed and be raised again the third day. And so Matthew paraphrases the words of Jesus, as does Mark, when he says, but I want you to notice how Mark words this. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders, of the chief priests, and the scribes. And then Luke actually records the words of Jesus. The Son of Man, Jesus said, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be slain and be raised the third day. Now, the reason that I point this out is because of a doctrine that is called replacement theology. What that means is there are people who believe that Jesus came to establish the kingdom. He was thwarted in his efforts to establish the kingdom because somehow God didn't know in advance that Messiah, his son, would be rejected. And therefore, Jesus established the church instead of the kingdom. Therefore, he's coming back sometime in our future. So that's where you get postmillennialism, premillennialism, dispensationalism, and you get into those doctrines. And they believe that he will then establish the kingdom, and he will go ahead and fulfill God's plan then. But this right here refutes that entire doctrine, because here we have Jesus predicting that he was going to be rejected. So this came as no surprise, in other words. Okay, so again, the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected of the elders and chief priests and scribes, be slain, be raised the third day. And see, this, not only do we have Jesus here predicting this, but this is found also in prophecy. Let's notice a couple of passages here. Psalms 2 begins with, "Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us." Now, we'll read the remainder of that little text there in just a minute. If you recall, in Acts chapter 3, Peter and John healed the man who was born lame. They carried him to the gate called Beautiful, and he would sit there day after day begging for alms. Peter and John approach him, come to him, and the man expects to receive something of them. Peter and John say, "Silver and gold have I none, such as I have give I thee. In the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk." They take him by the hand, lift him up, and he's healed completely immediately. This man was born lame. And he goes leaping and running and jumping with Peter and John into the temple. Well, this miracle caused quite a stir. And the leaders caught Peter and John and brought them before the council, and they could not find any way to punish them because of this great miracle and because all the people held them as prophets. And so and that's where the text says they straightly threatened them. They threatened them with a threat that they would not teach in this name anymore. And they let them go. This is the first time. The second time they beat him, but this time they let them go. And so this is where we find Peter quoting this passage here in Psalms. It says, "And being let go, they went to their own company and reported all that the chief priests and elders had said unto them. And when they heard that, they lifted up their voice to God with one accord and said, Lord, thou art God, which hath made heaven and earth and sea and all that in them is, who by the mouth of thy servant David has said, Why did the heathen rage?" See, he's quoting from Psalms 2. "Why did the heathen rage and the people imagine vain things? The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. For of a truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod, Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles, and the people of Israel were gathered together." Notice the collusion there between the Gentile leaders, Herod and Pilate and so forth, with the people of Israel, the leaders of Israel. This is the collusion that I referred to back in a previous lesson of this study of the image that Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of when you get down to the feet, that it's mixed with clay and iron, miry clay and iron. So that was the hint there of this collusion between Israel and the Gentile people, the Gentile leaders. And so here we have Peter quoting Psalms 2 and making application right there during his ministry. And so the people, they were gathered together for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done. And now, Lord, behold their threatenings, and grant unto thy servants that with all boldness they may speak the word. And so the psalm goes on and says, "He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and vex them in his sore displeasure. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion." So see, God's plan was not going to fail. And this was predicted way back. "I will declare the decree. The Lord has said unto me, Thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee." And I have some references there that you can check on your own time of where this statement is quoted and applied to the resurrection of Jesus, not his physical birth. "Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the utmost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron." You hear that language in Revelation. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. All right. So now we come back to this again. The Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be slain and be raised the third day. So again, another passage, Psalms 89. And again, I'm not going to read the entire psalm. There's quite a few verses in it, but take time to read that. My mercy will I keep for him forevermore, and my covenant shall stand fast with him. His seed also will I make to endure forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. Now, this is in reference to the covenant that God swore to David, that of his seed, pointing to Messiah, that he would raise up someone, the Messiah, to sit on David's throne. Again, this figurative language. This is what he's talking about here in this. If his children forsake my law and walk not in my judgments, if they break my statutes and keep not my commandments, then will I visit their transgression with the rod, and we just heard that from Psalm 2, and their iniquity with stripes. Nevertheless, my loving kindness will I not utterly take from him, nor suffer my faithfulness to fail. My covenant will I not break, nor alter. Notice that. See, that's the whole idea behind replacement theology, is that God had to change his plan because the Jews rejected the Messiah and he wasn't able to establish the kingdom. Jehovah said, I will not break my covenant. I will not alter the thing that has gone out of my lips. Once I have sworn by my holiness that I will not lie unto David. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. His throne, shall be established forever as the moon, and as the faithful witness in heaven. Okay, so again, God's covenant with David, it would not be broken, it would not be altered. So again, this was predicted way before, and this shows that God knew that his son would be rejected. And as a side note, notice that what I have colored in blue, his seed also will I make endure forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. Well, if his covenant would never be broken, and if Messiah's kingdom is going to last forever, then how long are the days of heaven going to last? His seed shall endure how long? Forever. And his throne as the sun. His throne, it shall be established forever as the moon. So again, if the days of heaven come to an end, if the sun and the moon and the universe implode, then wouldn't that force the conclusion that Messiah would cease, that his throne, his reign, his kingdom would cease? So again, that's a side note. Okay, now, just as we looked at the parallel texts of Matthew 16, Mark 8, and Luke 9, and I showed you how when we back up and look at the context, they are the exact same conversation, and just recorded by three writers. Well, we have essentially the same thing when we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke as we approach the Olivet Discourse, and that being Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And the reason that I want to demonstrate this is because someone made the statement that Luke 21, the record of the Olivet Discourse there, was written at a different time, or was spoken at a different time, as if, would that actually negate what Jesus says in the Olivet Discourse? But I want to show you this. Luke 22, we begin there in verse 41, and I'm not going to read all this. I just want you to look basically at what I have highlighted to show you that the context is the same. This is where Jesus asked the Pharisees, who is David's son? Okay, what think you of Christ? Whose son is he? So you see that in all three passages, here, and here in Luke 20 and Mark 12. Okay, now as we continue on, we come down to the portion here where Jesus warns his disciples of the scribes and Pharisees. Beware of the scribes. You see the same thing in Luke 20. Beware of the scribes. how they love the chief seats in the synagogues. You see that in both texts. Also, that they devour widows' houses, make long prayers. So we have the same thing in Matthew, and it's exactly parallel, except Matthew 23 is much longer text, but it's parallel. And I just want you to see that the texts are parallel. Again, as we continue, come on down through the text, we are approaching Mark 13. Here's Mark 12. We're approaching, and we actually come into Luke 21 right here. But we see that this is the account of the poor widow that cast in her 2 mites into the treasury. Matthew does not record that incident. So then as we continue, Matthew 24 begins with that they went out and departed out of the temple, and this is where they're admiring the great stonework of the temple. And so then Mark 13 begins with the same thing, see what manner of stones and what buildings. And the Olivet Discourse begins in Luke 21, verse 5. So you have the exact same conversations. You have the exact same parallel texts, subjects, contexts. Luke just places, or whoever decided to put the chapter breaks in, they put the chapter break at a different place here in Luke 21, as they did from Matthew and Mark. But I wanted you to see that these texts are exactly parallel. And there is, or at least I've not found anything to indicate that what is recorded in Luke 21 was spoken at a different time, and even if it was, it wouldn't change what is said, and it wouldn't change that it is exactly parallel with Matthew and Mark. Okay, so they're admiring the temple and the stonework of the temple, and that probably is something we would not be able to begin to imagine the magnificence of that structure. You know, we might look at something like the Taj Mahal and maybe get a glimpse, you know, of what that would be like. Josephus wrote, and there were some of these stones in the foundation of that structure that were about the size of my shop building, that is about 20 by 40 and about 11 feet tall, to do the math on them. And Josephus wrote that those stones were cut with such precision, and when they were put together, that you could scarcely see the joint. So, again, the magnificence of this is just probably beyond our comprehension. But I want us to notice that when we look at the question, and actually I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to look at what Jesus says here. They're admiring the temple, the stonework of the temple, and so forth. And Jesus makes this declaration in Matthew 24:2, "See you not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, again, another argument or deflection that has been made is when Jesus says, "See you not all these things," that he is lifting up his eyes and looking past the temple, and he's looking upon all of creation. Okay, so if we look at Mark's record, Mark says, "And as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples saith unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. Jesus answered, said unto him, Seest thou these great buildings?" So this has to harmonize with Matthew 24:2, all these things. This is what they're looking at. They are looking at and admiring the buildings of the temple. And so again, then in Luke 26 or 21:6, "These things which you behold, as for these things which you behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." And so Jesus makes this declaration of a catastrophic destruction of the temple. Now again, the fact that Jesus makes this prediction that the temple is going to be destroyed, this is not something new. He didn't just pull this out of his hat, so to speak. This was foretold in prophecy. For instance, if we go back to the little apocalypse that we have looked at a little bit in the previous lessons, we find that in chapter 25 and verse 2, for you have made a city a ruin, a fortified city a ruin, a palace of foreigners to be a city no more, it will never be rebuilt. And then in verse 12, the fortress of the high fort of your walls he will bring down, lay low, and bring to the ground, down to the dust. Again in chapter 26, Isaiah says, for he brings down those who dwell on high, the lofty city, he lays it low to the ground. He brings it down to the dust. And so Jesus appropriates this language in Luke 19, where he says, for the day shall come upon you, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. So again, here is Jesus appropriating this language. And this is the same thing that he says here in the Olivet Discourse. We also find in Jeremiah 26 that he says, thus saith the Lord of hosts, Zion shall be plowed like a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house as the high places of the forest. And notice that Jeremiah says right here, Micah prophesied of these days during Hezekiah king of Judah. And Micah said, therefore shall Zion for your sake be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house as the high places of the forest. So again, this was foretold in prophecy. And Jesus here is making this prediction and this declaration that the days are going to come that there's not going to be left one stone upon another that'll not be thrown down. And Josephus, who was an eyewitness to the destruction of Jerusalem and recorded those events, he wrote, Caesar gave orders that they should now demolish the entire city and temple, but should leave as many of the towers standing as were of the greatest eminency, that is, Phasaelus, I guess the pronunciation there, and Hippicus and Miriamne, and so much of the wall as enclosed the city on the west side. This wall was spared in order to afford a camp for such as were to lie in garrison, as were the towers also spared in order to demonstrate to posterity what kind of city it was and how well fortified, which the Roman valor had subdued. In other words, they wanted bragging rights. They wanted to be able to brag on what they had conquered. But for all the rest of the wall, it was so thoroughly laid even with the ground by those that dug it up to the foundation, that there was nothing left to make those that came thither believe it had ever been inhabited. So again, we find this in prophecy. We find Jesus appropriating that language and applying it to the destruction of Jerusalem, as well as here in the Olivet Discourse. And then in hindsight, we can look back and we see Josephus, who witnessed that, wrote about that, and it was fulfilled exactly as foretold. And so again, the three records here we have of the Olivet Discourse, and he says that there will not be left one stone upon another. And so then we'll look at Mark first. It says, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately. So Mark is the only one who gives us the information of who these disciples were who asked Jesus this question. Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? All right, we look at Luke's record of the question. They asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be, and what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? Now, I didn't point this out, but the words that are gray and italics, I just copied and pasted these, and that's the way it is in the text that I copied from the Bible. Those are words that are supplied by the translators. That's why I just left them the way they were. There's no special emphasis on those words. And so then Matthew's record of the question is, and he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Now this is the King James Version, obviously. And I'm going to suggest right here that this rendering of the word eon, which we'll look at here in just a little bit, as rendered as world, this is one of the worst theological blunders of all time, because this has given rise to more wild speculation of what this text is talking about than if they had translated it correctly, and that is an age, which again we'll look at in just a minute. But now I want us to look at the question. People get into all kinds of arguments about there's one question, there's two questions, there's three questions. It's really, and the reason they do that is so that they can break up the Olivet Discourse and try to say, well, some of it applies to the destruction of Jerusalem, while some of it applies to the end of time. But I want us to notice, if you look at Mark's record, the question is actually when and what sign. And in Luke, it's when and what sign. And so when we compare and when we harmonize all three records, again, we have when and what sign. When we look at Mark, all these things be fulfilled. Luke, when these things shall come to pass, then that would be the coming, and that would be the end of the age, the end of the world. That would be when all these things shall be fulfilled. So it's the same question. It's again, this is another instance of where we have the same thing being, in this case, it's a question, being asked in different ways. Just the writers recorded the same question differently. And so we have to recognize and honor all of them. Okay, so now in this question, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? I want to look at two words, but then also the phrase at the end of the world. Now, the word that is translated as world here in the King James Version is Heon. And this is where we get our English word eon. So who would use the word eon to refer to the universe, or to dirt, or to rocks and trees and so forth? Well, they wouldn't, because that's not what it means. And so this word define means an age, perpetuity, and by implication, the world, specifically, and this is how this is being used in reference to world, specifically Jewish, a messianic period, notice that, present or future. And so when this word is used, for instance, in our text in Matthew 24, then you have the aspect of present period of time or the future period of time. And again, Jesus talked about the present age, this age, and the age to come. So there's your present and your future use of that word. And so this particular word is used 128 times in the New Testament, and there's all the places it's used, and if you want to stop the video and look at that, you can, but there's all the instances where that particular word is found. And then you can look at how that it's translated. It's translated as ever and world and never, and the words highlighted in black and bold there, that's the way that it is translated in those texts. And so what I want us to look at when we think about this question, the disciples did not ask about the end of time, chronos. They did not ask about the end of kairos, the set or appointed time. They did not ask about the end of the cosmos. That's the universe or the orderly arrangement. They did not ask about the end of the earth, ge, G-E. They did not ask about the end of the heavens, Uranus. They did not ask about the end of the sea. But they did ask about the end of the age. That's the question they asked. Now, when we look at this phrase, the end of the world, and there it is in the Greek, that's copied right out of the interlinear. You have right here, this is the definite article, the, and then you have the word completion, which is sundalia. And then you have the definite article again, and the reason they're spelled differently, this is the feminine form of the definite article, this is the masculine form of the definite article. but you have the definite article, the completion of the age. So that's, again, that's what they are asking. So again, the word completion, and here it's end in the King James version, the end right here. This word, Santalia, means entire completion. That is consummation. And again, these are italicized. This is the way that it was found in the concordance, because he italicizes his words that he is using to define the word. Okay, so consummation, and he adds of a dispensation, which would be a period of time, not the universe. And it is translated only as the word end. It is only found 6 times in the New Testament. And we're going to look at, we already looked at one of them here in this text, and we're going to look at the other 5. Okay. In Matthew 13, Jesus teaches them a parable about a man going out and sowing seed. They come to him later, and they asked him to explain the parable to them. And so this is where we begin here, Matthew 13:37. He answered, said unto them, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. Now there it's cosmos. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the harvest, or is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the world. Again, that's King James. It's the end of the age. And the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world, this age. And again, this is the same phrase, with the exception of Matthew uses the demonstrative pronoun here, this, specifying this age. So you have to ask the question, what age was Jesus living in? The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity. Again, that's Daniel 7. When the Son of Man would come in the glory of the Father and so forth. Matthew 16. And cast him into a furnace of fire, there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. And that's Daniel 12:3, which we have not looked at yet. All right. Jesus teaches them another parable in between here that I'm not going to cover at this time. But then again, because it doesn't use that phrase. So again, then in verse 47, he says, Again, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a net that is cast into the sea and gathered of every kind, which, when it was full, they drew to shore, sat down, and gathered the good into vessels, but cast the bad away. Again, this is an analogy. The kingdom of heaven is like this. And he says, So shall it be at the end of the world, the end of the age. Same phrase. The angels shall come forth and shall sever the wicked from among the just. And again, this will fit with Matthew 24 and verse 31 when we get there. Shall cast him into a furnace of fire, there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Jesus said unto them, now notice this, Jesus said unto them, Have you understood all these things? They said unto him, Yes, Lord. Now I point that out because so many people, when they come face to face with Matthew 24 and the questions and the things that are taught there, then they say, and because this phrase is actually the end of the age, not the end of the universe, then they say, well, you know, the disciples were confused. They didn't know what they were asking, and they come up with all kinds of things to dodge what the text says. But here we have a point-blank statement that needs no interpretation. He said, Have you understood all these things? They said, Yes, Lord. All right, now the other two passages, Matthew 28, this is the Great Commission, where Jesus came and said, All power is given unto me in heaven and on earth. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the age. The word is a he on there, exact same phrase that is in Matthew 24:3. He's not saying, I am with you, apostles, until the end of time, until the end of the universe. That's not what he's saying. Now, again, that doesn't mean Jesus is not with us today. So can't make too much out of that statement. I'm just saying that's the phrase that is used here. And he is saying and telling them, encouraging them that he would be with them even through and until the end of the age. All right, then we find in Hebrews 9, Paul says, "For Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor yet that he should offer himself often, as the high priest entereth into the holy place every year with the blood of others. For then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world," cosmos, "but now, once, in the end of the world," King James Version, this is the end of the age, the exact same phrase that is used in Matthew 24:3. Now, Paul says, he has appeared now in the end of the age to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And so, if language means anything, I mean, if end is the opposite of beginning, then we should be able to comprehend that Jesus appeared at the end of the age, and that he didn't appear at the end of the Christian age, because we're still here 2,000 years later. He appeared at the end of the Jewish age, the age that he was living in, the Mosaic age, the law, under the law of Moses. And that's what Paul is saying here, that he has appeared now, once, at the end of the age, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And I'm going to throw one more verse in here, where Paul says to the Corinthians, and this is in the previous verses, he has outlined how that Israel was disobedient to God. They worshipped idols. They were punished, and many things had happened. And he says, all these things happened unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. That's age. It's the same word, but he uses a different word here for end. It's not suntelia, it's telos. It's in the same word family, but it's not the same word. And I throw that in to point that out, because Jesus uses, and Matthew uses, this same word kind of like a synonym as we go down through the Olivet Discourse, speaking of the end, which would be the end of the age, because that's the only end that's talked about in the Olivet Discourse. But notice that he says that upon whom the ends of the age are come, not did come back at the cross or at Pentecost, but they are come. The ends of the age are come. They are present right then. And those are verses where telos is used in the Olivet Discourse. Okay, now the other word that I want to look at is when they ask, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming? Now, the end of the age. I want to look at the word coming. And this word here is from the Greek word parousia, and it is a singular noun, and it is always singular. And it is defined as a being near, that is advent and return. Now again, I emphasize those words in the brownish goldish color there because they're italicized. That's Strong's emphasis, because that's the definition of the word. Now he adds a little bit of his own idea here, specifically of Christ to punish Jerusalem, or finally the wicked. And see, he doesn't realize that those are the one and the same thing. But anyway, it is a being near, advent, return, and then by implication, it is physical aspect. And so this word is used 24 times in the New Testament, and I color-coded there. The ones in green are where that is used in the sense of this physical aspect, okay? While the others are specific references to the coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ. And if you wanted to take the time to count, there are 17 of the 24 usages where it is applied specifically to the coming of Christ. For instance, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, "For since by man came death, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. But each one in his own order, Christ the firstfruits, afterward they who are Christ at his coming. Same word. Then comes the end. When he delivers the kingdom to God the Father, when he puts an end to all rule and all authority and power. So this is why I say that it's critical that we understand the terminology that is being used. Because when Paul uses the same language, the same term, in conjunction with the end, then he has to be talking about the same end. And that's one thing that so many people that we have missed through the decades, is the narrative of the Bible. It all points to one eschaton, and that is the last days of Old Covenant Israel, when Messiah would come and set up his kingdom, which would be a spiritual kingdom which would never be destroyed. Daniel 2:44. For he must reign till he has put all enemies under his feet, Paul says. And the verbs must and reign are both in the present tense. And so when you really stop and think about that, that shows us that the millennium of Revelation 20 was already underway, because he was already reigning. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death, and that's actually the death in the original with the definite article. All right, in James 5, James wrote, "Be patient, establish your heart, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." So again, same term. So he has to be talking about the same thing. There's not multiple comings of the Lord at the end of the age. It's all one coming. And so this is where we're going to stop our study. And so I hope that we have looked at a few things that will help us as we start to go down through the Olivet Discourse. And I'm not going to take time to look at every verse. I want to just go down through it and look at some highlights, just so that we can get a grasp of the setting of it, the context of it, and how that it ties in with some other prophecies, of course, and particularly Daniel 7 and also Daniel 12, which, again, we have not looked at Daniel 12 yet. But this is what we want to do as we continue this study. And then maybe not too far from now, I want to show you some passages that will emphatically show when the last days period was. Okay, we've already seen when it began. It began with John the Baptist. Jesus said the law and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presses into it. So it began, this last days period began with John the Baptist. And so then we want to look at some passages that will show the duration of this last days period. And so again, we'll end our study here with these thoughts.